Right, we're ready to go.
Okay. Right, so I'm Anne-Marie Clark. I'm one of the Band 7 occupational therapists with the Community Neuro Rehab team in central Lancashire. So we're going to be giving a presentation sort of on cognition, looking mainly at sort of either end of the scale, really. So those sort of low-level patients who sometimes we have difficulty assessing because of other things like language and communication difficulties, but also the other end of the scale where we've got very high functioning patients who are still coming back with difficulties where it's not quite as obvious as to what those difficulties might be. Please feel free to pop questions in the chat or pop your hand up if there's anything you want to ask. So the objectives of today really is sort of by the end of the session, you should understand what cognition is, why is it important to separate sort of the language and communication difficulties out, how to assess those low-level patients. Oops. With language and communication difficulties. It's not gone off sharing. Just hold on one sec. Hold on a second, it's just gone off the sharing.
Just go back into Teams.
Not sure.
Yeah,
it's not coming
and then
up.
just go to slideshow.
Okay, so why is it important to complete those joint assessments with SLT for cognition? Like I've just said, looking at those higher level cognition and how that impacts on sort of work and vocational rehab and the impact that it has on physical rehab and physio. So when we're thinking about cognition, so what is this? So this refers to processes such as attention, memory, executive functioning, information processing, and those visual processing skills. So when we're looking at attention, that's consisting of 5 levels, and this is sort of focused attention, sustained attention, selective, alternating, and divided. So I'll go into that in a little bit more detail about the selective and divided elements of attention with those higher level patients sort of later on in the presentation. So looking at memory, as we're aware, memory is broadly categorised sort of based on its duration, the conscious awareness that's sort of required for that memory and its function. And this sort of understanding helps clinicians tailor specific restorative and compensatory strategies to individuals' specific impairments. So we might be looking at sort of primary memory types targeting in therapy, the first of which is sort of working memory, which is that active processing and that mental workspace that holds and manipulates information in real time. And then the long-term memory, which is that conscious recall. And that's the information that we intentionally search for, retrieve, and consciously state. And there's various subtypes to this, which are sort of the explicit and declarative memory, which is our conscious recall. So you've got your episodic memory, which is like your recollection of personal events, specific experiences, and autobiographical details. So things like what you had for your breakfast, your last holiday, those types of things. Then you have your semantic memory, which is your general knowledge of the world, sort of including facts, word definitions and concepts. So things like knowing what an apple is, what the capital city of a country is. You then have your implicit and non-declarative memory, which is that unconscious recall. So that's things like your knowledge and behaviours that are automatically accessed and used without conscious effort. So these are like your procedural memory. So that's the muscle memory that we have of those motor skills required to carry out tasks. So that's things like how to ride a bike, how to tie your shoelaces, how to type on a keyboard. And that's often the most preserved type of memory that we have. Following that, you have like your prospective memory. So this is the ability to remember and perform an action or carry out an intention at a future point in time. So that's being able to plan sort of when things need to be done. So taking your medication at 2 o'clock, for example, or turning off the oven within the correct time scale. So moving on to executive functionings, this is a high-level set of processes that allows individuals to manage thoughts, actions and emotions and to achieve specific goals. So you need to think of this a bit like your CEO of the brain. So these cognitive skills make it possible to plan and focus attention and remember instructions and then juggle multiple tasks successfully and quite often simultaneously. So information processing. So this is the framework that describes how the brain receives, interprets, stores, retrieves, and then uses the information we get from the environment. It compares the human brain to sort of like a computer. So viewing thinking as a structured sequence of mental operations. And the four main stages of this are the input, the encoding of the information, the storage, and then the output of what we do with that information. So visual processing skills, this refers to the brain's ability to make sense of, interpret and analyse what the eyes see. So it allows the brain to give meaning to visual stimuli and integrate them into existing knowledge. So the core visual processing skills we need to consider are visual discrimination, your visual memory, your visual sequential memory, visual closure, and your figure ground discrimination. So visual spatial skills are quite a major subset of visual processing, and they specifically handle the spatial relationship between objects, your body, and the environment. So this is looking at spatial relationships, that visual spatial orientation, that mental rotation, and the visual motor integration. So why is it important to separate these cognitive skills from language and communication difficulties? So as we're aware, a stroke can affect both cognition, language and communication. So for example, a patient with cognitive deficits like memory and attention might struggle with communication, but the language structure could be preserved. Or a patient with aphasia, language impairment, might appear forgetful and inattentive, but their memory and executive functions could be intact. The subtleties in the presentation can sometimes be misinterpreted, and the patients can confuse what they're describing and what they are experiencing. So you can go and see your patient, and how many times we heard a patient say to us, "Oh, my memory is terrible. I just can't think of that word when I'm trying to explain something." And he's trying to get the patient to understand that potentially that may be word finding difficulties and not a problem with the memory, and sort of vice versa. Like, "Oh, I'm terrible. I can't tell people what I want to say. I just keep going off on tangents all the time." Whereas it's not necessarily a language or a communication difficulty. It's around that sustained and selective attention. So it's important to tease out sort of what those difficulties actually mean. So why is it important to separate out the assessments? So basically to ensure an accurate diagnosis, like we've said. So misattributing cognitive deficits to language problems can cause underdiagnosis of things like post-stroke dementia or executive dysfunction. And likewise, assuming language deficits of cognition might delay the aphasia therapy if we've not sort of interpreted that correctly. So the rehab we might be looking at, sort of in quite general terms, are that for cognitive difficulties, we might be looking at memory strategies, attention programs, problem-solving skills, and visual processing tasks. Whereas for speech and language therapy, it might be things around word retrieval, comprehension exercises, or alternative methods of communication. Also, from a prognosis point of view, cognitive impairment is quite a good predictor of post-stroke recovery. The level of independence we're expecting somebody to get to, and also the sort of quality of life long term. So how to separate them in practice? It's about using non-verbal assessments with patients who have aphasia or speech difficulties and eliminate the need for verbal and written comprehension. So using activities where tasks can be demonstrated and copied, so puzzles, matching, tasks, visual spatial tasks, where you don't need to actually speak to them in terms of giving instructions, they can copy what you're doing. Observe functional performance without giving instructions. So can the person follow multi-step tasks with the use of gesture for the instruction, or follow a visual description of a task in a picture format? Can they remember daily routines without prompts? It's also useful to have that combined input from the MDT involving other people like your neuropsychologist, your physiotherapy, and like I said, the speech and language therapist in those assessments. So this is just a little bit of a poster, sort of in terms of looking sort of at what we've just said. And it looks, like I say, on the left-hand side about the cognitive and thinking skills and the language and communication. Looks at the problems that might have different causes, the targeted rehab and the effects on the function and safety. So I've just put that as a little bit of a visual guide. But I think sort of what we can have as the takeaway message is that we need to be looking at cognition and language and communication sort of as a whole and not trying to separate them out, because this gives sort of better, accurate understanding, helps with targeted therapy, and hopefully we'll have better outcomes for our patients. So looking at sort of assessing the lower functioning patients. So why is a joint assessment with SLT important? So it's looking at individual professional assessments can be too rigid. We don't always want to sort of strip things right back to take sort of environment and things like that out of context, because it can obscure what a person is capable of. So having that combined approach gives a much better, accurate, functional and realistic picture when both professionals have input, bringing their expertise together. So it's looking sort of communication, cognition and function are separate, but they do heavily overlap. A person may understand more than they can express. They may appear cognitively impaired when actually it's the fact they can't comprehend the language that we're using. So if SLT assesses language in isolation, they may be getting poor responses and interpreted as reduced cognition. And if OT assesses in isolation, poor task performance might be interpreted as a motor or cognitive deficit, when actually it's a comprehension difficulty that they're not actually understanding what we're asking them to do. So that combined approach helps us to see what the patient can understand, allows for those clinical reasoning discussions after the assessment, can truly see what they can do functionally and how they communicate and how, and then this allows for that good clinical reasoning discussion sort of afterwards. It reduces the risk of underestimating ability. So low-level patients are particularly vulnerable to being identified as having low cognition, not engaging, they're unable to participate, but in reality they may have intact cognition, but they're just unable to access tasks due to language barriers and difficulty communicating the needs. So that joint assessment allows the SLTs to adapt communication styles, look at gesture, visual support, that total communication approach, while as an OT you're concentrating on assessing the functional ability using those supportive adaptations from your colleagues. This can reveal hidden abilities if time is taken to consider all aspects of the assessment and the options we can use. It improves validity of assessment findings. Quite often the standardised assessments we use rely on understanding instructions and the giving of responses, and both of these can be impaired in aphasia. So together we can look at modifying task delivery, observing functional performance and cross-checking that consistency across all modalities. And that will then increase confidence that results reflect real ability and not a communication breakdown. So it's supporting assessment through multiple modalities. So those low functioning patients respond better to visual cues, gesture, object use and environmental context. So combined, we can assess cognition through doing something, showing them how to do it, and then observing their behaviour following this. So it enhances detection of intentionality and awareness. So the key questions to ask with low functioning patients is the response intentional? So joint working will help to identify that consistent yes-no response and whether that's what we're seeing. Are there purposeful movements that are happening during the task? And is there any error awareness and problem solving that patient is trying to demonstrate? And together, assessment can build a stronger case for looking at those patients who are very low level that we may class as sort of being PDOC patients, and do they have emerging cognition? Do they have a degree of decision-making ability? and then having a look at their rehab potential. So the takeaway message from this is that combining OT and SLT assessments with low functioning patients with aphasia is not just helpful, but essential. It allows clinicians to separate language impairment from cognition. It reveals true functional ability, avoids misdiagnosis and underestimation, and therefore we can deliver more accurate, meaningful rehab programs. So again, I've just put that together sort of in a little bit of a poster. There's a little bit of a takeaway as to what you might want to look at from an assessment and what things you might use during those assessments. So just a little bit of food for thought. So just a little bit of an activity. I'm not expecting everybody to sort of answer the question. But you have a lady who's had a stroke about 6 weeks ago. She's not been engaged in therapy and has had limited social interaction due to being in a bed for prolonged periods of time in a single room. So that could be on a ward, it could be in a nursing home, it could be somebody who's bedbound at home. So they've sort of got a few scenarios there. So as part of your assessment, what types of activity might you complete at bedside to ascertain a level of cognition as a joint MDT assessment? So is there anybody who would like to give a few examples? You could pop that in the chat or, yeah, pop your hand up. Okay, Samantha.
Hi, I'm Marie. Everyone's gone quiet now. I was just thinking with this lady, you'd maybe do some like copying tasks to see if she could do that, like a house or circles, something that's, like you say, simple without that the verbal bit of involvement.
Yeah.
See if she can like follow patterns, like moving her arms as well. Like, can she copy gestures?
Yeah, yeah. Somebody's popped in the chat as well about sort of looking at the mocker, and then maybe sort of, let's say, matching tasks, React to program on the iPad, which has got some tasks on there that would look at sort of the comprehension side of things as well as cognition. That's good. Okay. So just moving on, sort of looking at those types of things. Oh, hold on, there's another one. Talk to her to see how much she interacts, what she can remember. Can she talk through doing tasks such as making a cup of tea, copying movements, etc.? Yeah, it's good. Brilliant. So yeah, so some of those examples we've sort of got on here. I'm not going to sort of run through because obviously there's quite a lot of things we can do with this. But again, like you said, matching objects, matching family members to children, shapes and colours, keeping it very low level. So from an attentional ability point of view, they've not got a lot to sort of think of with that cognitive load. Getting them to have items and matching one of the items to something that's the same if you've got a choice of two. Again, you may need to gesture, show them first, and then see if they can retain that and copy and carry that over. Just got some practical tasks looking at sort of functional things that people may have been involved in before to try and tap into that sort of automatic sort of system. Even if it's just a case of doing something like giving them a book or a newspaper, do they start to automatically turn the pages of the book as if they recognise what it is? Sort of holding on to a bowl, trying to put the lid back on a jar, sort of very sort of small tasks which everybody should know how to do, because you always get those scenarios, don't you, where they say, oh, well, they would never have done that before. But these are all tasks that everybody would have done sort of in their daily lives. Things like planting seeds, stirring drinks, putting stamps on envelopes. And there's a little bit of a list there about things that people can sort of engage in. But it's remembering that you're not expecting these people to necessarily do the whole task. It's about whether they can start it or finish it or just do a small element to show that they've got that awareness of what's actually in front of them and sort of what the process that we're asking them to do actually is. And again, you can sort of look at that copying, and do they sort of tap into sort of what you're doing once you've shown them. So what can we use to assess cognition in a non-standardised with patients who can engage physically? So these are people who, you know, have some degree of, you know, sort of physical ability when you're asking them to do something. They're not your patients who are sort of not responding and aren't taking sort of on board any sort of tasks that you're asking them to do. So like I was saying before, sort of visual cancellation tasks, can they just put a cross through something on a piece of paper? Can they pick out specific shapes among distractors? Are they sort of at that level where they can identify what you're asking them to do? The trail making, which is a little bit like what's on the mocker, but whether you can sort of have it a little more at a basic level. You might just be connecting numbers or coloured dots in a sequence. Again, you can do that through demonstration. That's symbol digit substitution, matching symbols to numbers or shapes visually. And obviously all these tasks can be graded, sort of increasing in complexity of task. So if you set off at a basic level, you can then move up to sort of more of that multitasking and following a rule. So it might be sort of looking at sorting tasks. Can they sort cutlery into sections? Do they recognise the difference and understand the rule of what you're asking them to do? Sorting playing cards into suits or colours, coins, things like that. Pairing up objects. Doing activities such as sort of Jenga, Connect Four, dominoes. Again, we're not necessarily expecting them to play by the rules, but it's about what they do with that. Do they initiate doing something, even if it's just stacking, sorting them, moving into piles? Are they engaging with the task in the first place? Looking at jigsaws, that could be of sort of family members and people like that, but just setting off with very basic things at maybe 2 or 3 pieces. Memory, you might have sort of visual memory spans showing sort of like a sequence of lights, colours or images, and then asking them to reproduce what you've just done or arranging objects. That object recognition and delayed recall, so presenting objects or pictures to the individual, removing items and then asking them to identify the original item from the set. So things like Kim's game, stuff like that is quite good, but sometimes it's easier to do it with actual objects rather than pictures. And that pattern recall, so creating block designs or shapes sort of after sort of brief exposure. So that's sort of looking at things. They do a little bit of that sort of in the CAM assessment. Executive function and memory sort of difficulties. So sorting cards or object by colours, shapes and patterns. Changing the rule sort of part way through to see if they've got that rule shift and that cognitive flexibility. With people who are a little bit higher level, sort of cognitively, doing like block things such as the Tower of Hanoi, which obviously is quite difficult, or block design. And then the non-verbal mazes and puzzle completion, so navigating through mazes or completing jigsaw-style puzzles. So for your visual, spatial and construction skills, sort of copying figures, sort of geometric shape patterns, objects of 2D or 3D drawings, again, your block design and those spatial orientation tasks. If you've got access to the Brainwave art books, there's quite a few things sort of in the visual processing section of that book for those. Looking at your motor praxis, so like I just said before about imitation of gesture, hand movements or sequences demonstrated by the therapists, and then looking at tool use and object manipulation to look at whether there's any form of apraxia sort of there. So things like stacking cups, opening containers, sometimes just giving somebody a pen to try and write the name or make marks on a piece of paper is quite often a good thing to sort of do without verbal instruction. Your reasoning and problem solving, your pattern completions, asking them to select or arrange missing items, using pictures and symbols to represent relationships and ask them to match the logical pairs. So again, that's quite good with sort of family sort of pictures. Sorting and classification games, provide multiple items and ask them to group them by a rule, but again, demonstrating it visually. And then that sort of non-verbal cognitive screening tools. So these would be for people who are more higher level but have difficulty from a comprehension point of view, because they are quite difficult. You've got your Raven progressive matrices, which is looking at abstract reasoning and problem solving without language. So it's sort of all visual when you look at it. And then there's the lighter international performance scale. So that's usually done by neuropsychologists. And it is quite a complicated sort of assessment. So you'd have to be thinking your patient was sort of higher level for those screening tools. So thinking about the patients at the other end of the scale now, so those higher functioning patients and the impact of cognition on vocational rehab and physio. So we've all had those patients who tell us they're fine, functioning well in their own home. When they leave the house or return to work, they find that they're struggling. The symptoms of fatigue increase, they get increased headaches, they stumble and trip when they're outside. So what do we think the cause of this might be? So higher level of attention. So if we go back to sort of what we were saying about attention before in that hierarchy, people with the higher level attention difficulties is usually what we miss sort of when people are at home, because things are quite automatic and you're not doing those sort of higher level divided attention tasks as much on a day-to-day basis. That's the sort of category these patients fall into. So it's the level of selected and divided attention that we need for these tasks when accessing the community or the workplace than when we're at home. So the problems that we find with these are caused by two systems. So it's a sensory orientating system, and this mediates your selective attention and what your brain needs to sort of focus on at any point in time, and the executive attention system. And this looks at your divided attention, that alternative attention, and your attentional control in tasks. So if you think about your sensory orientating system, you've got to imagine this as a bit like a torch beam. So it directs your brain onto what the important issue is at that point in time. And that's done through picking up on sensory stimulus and cues. And that's part of your posterior parietal network in your brain. And it sort of establishes selective attention by covertly disengaging, so consciously disengaging from one thing and moving and engaging that internal spotlight to a response from either an internal or an external cue, and then helps you to process. So these can be sort of either overt, which is obvious, or covert. So it's sort of depending on the amount of sort of focus that your brain has to have. So your overt focus is that act of deliberately directing your senses. So you are purposely turning your eyes or your head or ears towards a specific stimulus in the environment. So you're consciously aware of looking at it or listening to it. Whereas your covert focus is non-obvious. So the cognitive ability to mentally process a specific object or location in your field of view without moving your eyes or body to look at it directly. So these are things that we can sort of see on our periphery vision, but we're aware that they're there, but we're not necessarily actually turning to look at them. So some of our patients may have their attention on something different to what we're actually wanting them to fixate on. And experience informs us that in many instances, the individual seems to be able to move their overt focus, so their conscious and sort of deliberate focus, more quickly than their sort of peripheral sort of covert focus. So in the executive attention system, this needs to be controlled. So any fixing or locking onto a stimuli may need to be temporarily stopped. So in order to respond to something else coming from a sort of outside and then resumed. There may be concurrent activities, and the future course of all these is that everything is coordinated. So you've got that attentional control to be able to move through that attentional ability. So this level of attention is required when tasks involve planning, error detection, whether they're novel or new learning tasks, things that are difficult to process, or conflict between competing stimuli. So that's where we sort of class divided attention. So your brain needs to be able to concentrate on more than one task at the same time. So how can we assess and treat this in our higher functioning patients? Quite a lot of these patients will do really well on sort of those standardised assessments, such as the MOCA and the CAM and the Rhythm-E behavioural memory test. So you need sort of higher level, sort of more complex assessments, such as say the T-test or the BADS assessment. And these look at things in relation to that higher level attentional activity for those problem solving and switching skills, which involve complex planning and organisation. Looking at self-rating scales of performance in tasks and actually asking your patient sort of what are they struggling with now that they're out of their home environment, and also looking at behavioural observations in busy environments, complex processing tasks, which include that combination of physical and cognitive elements running simultaneously. So for treatment, most attention training programs are based on the notion that attentional abilities can be improved by providing opportunities for stimulation of a particular aspect of attention. So that's why it's quite important to be able to work out sort of on that hierarchy where the difficulty is and which level we're looking at. So this usually involves individuals engaged in a series of repetitive drills or exercises that are designed to provide opportunities for practice on tasks with sort of that ever-increasing attentional demand. So we should be looking sort of from an approach point of view of combining sort of education, that process skills training, strategy training to help them manage, but also the functional activities training. And hopefully sort of each of these components should include awareness training, sort of in an attempt to help the individual move towards a new sense of self, so they understand sort of what is causing the increase in symptoms that they're getting. So what sort of things can we be getting people to do to look at those sort of really high level attention difficulties? So if you've got people who are saying sort of about balance issues, tripping up when outside, which they don't do when they're at home, it's things like have them completing high level balance exercises on a balance pad or wobble board while throwing and catching a ball and counting backwards in 2s and 5s, all at the same time. Working up to more complex tasks such as reciting and counting backwards in 7s, which takes a lot more cognitive processing. Walking across uneven ground while looking to the left and right, observing their environment. Talking about what they can see, hear and smell in a descriptive way, or again reciting a poem or counting backwards in 7s. Have them walking an assault course of balance beams, stepping over markers while circling a hula hoop on their arms and completing cognitive reciting tasks. So as you can see from those activities, it's about combining those sort of automatic physical elements that they shouldn't have to think about whilst they're doing something cognitive at the same time to try and get that sort of divided attention. So if you've got somebody who's working in a busy office environment and they're finding this overloading, you could get them opening and transferring information between multiple spreadsheets. The information that they're actually transferring at this point isn't important, so it doesn't matter whether they're just putting numbers from one spreadsheet to another. But while they're completing this, listening to a podcast, and then after about 15 minutes, get them to stop the task that they're doing, write down what they've heard from the podcast or news article, and then resume the activity they were doing, but at the point where they left off, so they don't have to go back to sort of check where they were up to. And then grading the degree of background noise as if they're working in a busy environment. So whilst they're listening to the podcast or news article, also have something else on in the background. So selectively, they have to block out that background noise. Okay, so thank you for listening. It was a little bit of a whistle stop tour. I hope it's been helpful and given you some food for thought in your practice. Has anybody got any questions or comments from that?
I do.
Typical.
So thank you very much for that. I'm just wondering if you could talk to us about the impact of fatigue and overload. So you've spoken about kind of those higher level patients, all those patients that we have where on the surface of it, say it looks like they've got maybe a combination of both kind of cognition issues and language issues. What do you think about the impact of fatigue and overload?
Well, it's a big issue for a lot of our patients, as we all know, and I think it's a little bit sort of like remembering that cognitive overload and the impact of fatigue can make other symptoms worse. So making sure your patient fully understands what that is, but also that pacing, and making sure that they're looking at that 24-hour routine. They're splitting their day up into sort of what we would class as more physical and cognitive activities, and not spending a lot of time on, say, all morning sort of on cognitive activities, whether that be very low level stuff, or for our high level patients, you hear people saying things like, oh, well, I've only been on my phone, I've only been watching TV all day. So it's about them understanding sort of what the impact of that overload and fatigue has, and working out sort of how to manage that and grade that sort of during the day.
And then my other question was about kind of the tasks that you suggest. So in terms of that list of functional assessment tasks, I'm assuming then that some of those you're suggesting that they could be therapeutic tasks.
Yeah. And it might be that you can hand those over to family as well. So when they're visiting, they can do that and have that better understanding, because they know their relative much better than we do as to what tasks would be, sort of second nature to them, really. And obviously things that are more automatic to that person, whether they're sort of engaging at a very low level or a higher level, we want to try and tap into that automatic sort of system to see what their level of cognition is like. And if it's automatic, that you're more likely to see that planning and sequencing and those types of tasks and get their attention, rather than something that's new learning sort of initially.
Sure.
Good. Okay. Questions? Susie?
Hi, Anne-Marie, thank you. That was a whistle-stop tour. Well done. I was just thinking about that kind of cognitive hierarchy as well. I know a number of times people say, oh, they've failed a certain test, and then you kind of actually, you need to make sure that their eyesight and their hearing and all of those factors have been checked out in the peripheral vision, and, they haven't got those issues, because that's going to skew any of your outcomes, or, yeah. And actually when you improve those things, people can improve quite significantly as well. So just always bearing that in mind before you start assuming everything from tests, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing how much you can work out from practical tests and talking to people without whipping out your test kits and all those things we haven't got easy access to often in the community as well. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I suppose it's just understanding what each thing assesses, isn't it? And sort of doing that activity analysis and breaking it down to sort of, like I say, even at a very low level, what is that patient actually trying to do, or what I'd be able to engage in? So
yeah, thank you.
And I think we've all encountered that either, information that has come from other sources where it either says on the referral, or, we've had conversations with others where they say, oh, it's been really difficult to assess their cognition because because of their aphasia, because of their communication. And I think that's the case, isn't it, for a lot of formal assessments, but it's then what you do with that, and how you look at that informally, perhaps.
And I've always found involving SALT, it's amazing what they can do and what access they've got to tests and things, and working beside them where people have got aphasia to actually look at cog issues is really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's why it's important to do those assessments together, especially with those lower level patients who you're struggling to, if they can't communicate with you and you're not quite sure what they're understanding, sort of doing that together is, it's invaluable, really.
Right. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for that brilliant presentation. Being non-clinical, I can see what a complex area it is. So thanks very much for going into such depth. If anybody wants an attendance certificate, can you please put the name in the chat, name and their email address. And I've also put the QR code for the feedback form on the training as well in there as well. So if you could please provide some feedback, but that's thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, brilliant.